Okay, I want to practice what I preach. And yesterday we talked about the findings from the needs assessment. And one of the things was that growers are not in food safety every day. And so we need to remember to kind of back up and do more of a landscape overview and not just be in the weeds, because sometimes we lose people. And Chris and I often talk about how we think about this every day, all day. Well, not all day, but and we're in the weeds and we know why we're doing the things we're doing in the agenda. And I need to just stop and I need to remind you and come back, do more of a landscape. And I want to just, for those of you who've been here for a while, you may remember that we've been doing these inspectional observational findings, but I don't know how many of you remember the history of why we're doing them. Can you raise your hand if you remember some of those early discussions of why are we why are we collecting inspectional observational data and presenting it? Nobody. Chris and Donna and Wes. Thank you, Wes. Okay. So the point of all of this is, so NECAF's, when it was first formed in 2016, Chris talked about the planning grant that they did in Amherst. And a lot of the discussion around that was forming sort of this regional network, because a lot of people were saying, I'm recreating things that other people have already done, or I'm getting questions from growers and I'm trying to answer it, but that's not my area of expertise. But I know that there's somebody in another state doing that. And so when the regional center funding came out, what Chris did and the team, they sent out a survey to all of the educators and regulators in the region and said, we're forming this network, this regional network, we have funding coming in, what do you want it to look like? And the survey came back and said, we want to share resources, we want to collaborate, and we want to do work together so that we're not duplicating effort, that we can benefit from each other, and that we can learn and grow from each other's experiences and knowledge. And so what we do in the Northeast looks very different than what other regional centers do, the other 3 regional centers. If you've ever been to any of the other regional center meetings, they're very different. And that's because we built this sort of network based on, Chris and the original project team built this network to look like this so that we can work together and collaborate and share expertise and understanding and perspectives. And so as we were having conversations with the regulators 4 years ago, inspections were starting. And the regulators said, why are we only talking about educational projects? We have inspectional findings. We should be talking about inspectional findings, because if we're going to be developing educational projects, they should really be based on what the issues are, or the challenges that growers are having in the region. And we're out there on farms, we're seeing where they're struggling to make practice implementations, where they're struggling to make decisions, where there's confusion. And we think that that's an important perspective to bring into this conversation. And we said, yeah, that's a really good idea. And so Christina mentioned Leah. Leah was in Maine, and she said, why don't I gather all this information and I'll do sort of a qualitative analysis of the inspectional findings. And we've been doing that now for 3 years, and Christina has taken that on over the last 2 years. But the idea of that is to say, what's actually going on? The people who are on the farm looking at these things through the lens of the rule, what are they seeing? And what is that perspective? And so last year, we were virtual, and I don't know if you remember, we had a worker training panel. Steve was on it. He's not here. Kim Carlin, I can't remember, Tucker. Michael moderated it. And the purpose of that is because we were sort of listening to conversations around worker training in regulator groups, and the conversation on worker training in regulator groups and the challenges was very different than the understanding of challenges in the educator group. And it was clear that those people have their own perspectives based on their, the way they work with their audiences, right? You go in with that lens, and that's what you see. And then there were challenges with, well, why aren't we seeing these things covered in education, or why aren't we seeing these things brought up during inspections? And there just wasn't a lot of communication. Not that there's just gaps, right? Gaps in understanding of what people are seeing based on their interactions with growers. And so we've adopted this approach, and we're going to have an inspector panel come up. But the reason for that is because we need to sort of be able to unpack these things and hear those conversations from both sides, both lenses, both perspectives, and recognize sort of, okay, as we start to think about how we might tackle technical assistance or educational outreach, how can we do it in a way that is actually addressing the root cause of what's happening on farms and why there is noncompliance or why there's misunderstandings. So doing a better job of sort of getting to those root causes so that we can not put a Band-Aid on, but we can actually address the cause and help to support them sort of from the ground up. So anyway, I just wanted to sort of pull back a little bit and remind people of those conversations. And, you know, we're not doing this randomly. There's intention to it. It's informed by all of your feedback and your input. And I just wanted to take a second to kind of reframe that. So with that, Erin is moderating our inspector panel. And I will invite Mark and Ben and Chris to come up for our inspector panel. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Hopefully this panel will reveal some priority needs as indicated by our inspectional findings, and we hope this will be the beginning of a conversation where educators and regulators can understand specific on-farm educational needs better. Okay, we have Chris Ruckel, Rhode Island.
Nailed it.
Sorry, Chris. Big Bend, Massachusetts. Mark Scarpina, New York State. Thank you, folks, for being on this panel. What specific misunderstandings are you seeing on farms? And could you give us one anonymized example with specifics?
Yes. Testing? All right, there we go. So one big example that I see is when tools and equipment are no longer able to be properly cleaned and sanitized. So an example of this is I was going on an inspection and walking into a leafy green packing room where they wash, pack, and process leafy greens. And right in front of me was a plastic cutting board. And so I'd say, oh, okay, there we go. There's a plastic cutting board. And looking a little bit closer at it, we see that the cleaning and sanitation policy was sitting posted right above the cutting board. And awesome, great. That helps their workers know exactly how to clean and sanitize. The problem being is that there was very deep cuts in that cutting board. And you could see visible filth starting to build up and making it no longer able to be cleaned and sanitized. So what I asked naturally was, when was the last time this was clean and sanitized? Which in reply, the farmer said, you know, it was just clean and sanitized before you got here. And so in that sense, you have to stop and have a conversation with them and say, you know, your cleaning and sanitation policy seems to be fitting, but there are these deep gashes in this cutting board, and even with proper cleaning and sanitation techniques, you're placing leafy greens still on visible filth, which could provide a source of contamination. So this is something that needs to be addressed. Unfortunately, I then proceeded to turn around and see a leafy green spinner. And it was the traditional makeshift leafy green spinner out of a washing machine. And what they did was they stripped it all apart and they took a pool noodle and they placed it along the inner edge. And so I asked the farmer, you know, what made you do this? And his simple response was, well, it's a very sharp edge on the inner side. I want to protect my workers. But what he didn't realize was, being a very wet, humid environment, there was tons of green filth built up on the underside of the noodle, and that was coming in contact with all the leafy greens that he was then spinning. So any cleaning and sanitation step before it was being spun had all gone out the window. And while he was trying to protect his farmers and his workers and do the right thing, it ended up providing a source of possible contamination.
Something that I've noticed in a lot of the farms that I've been to, I think farmers seem to understand cleaning harvest bins and storage bins, like post washing and sanitizing, if they're storing things in coolers or what have you. They understand they need to clean them. They sometimes sanitize them. But then there's sort of a misuse of the crates. I don't know that there's always a thought of the chain of custody or the route of contamination. So it's not a specific farm, but I can't, probably at least 10 times this year, I would have to talk to a farmer about they would wash their harvest crates and then put them on the floor of the packing room to dry. So it's the floor is wet from all the day's washing, and they would stack them on top of each other to dry without a barrier between the floor and the crate. And it's all right, well, now it's not really clean again. I would see a lot of examples of people taking harvest crates and using them as display in their farm stands. So it comes right from the field, looks real nice, looks real cool. It's in the the plastic baskets or the wooden baskets, and then it goes out onto display. And there's not a policy of washing those crates before they come back into circulation. So everyone in the public with their weird, gross hands are touching the display and are oh my God, this looks beautiful, and touching their mouths and touching the thing. So farmers understand that they need to be clean, but they're not always considering, I think, all the routes of contamination. That constantly I would be are these crates allowed to touch the ground, or are they not allowed to touch the ground? Are these crates washed after they're used, or are they not washed after they're used? It sort of came up pretty frequently. I also think a lot of farmers they feel like sanitizing harvest crates after every use I don't see that very prevalent. I mean, they understand they need to be clean, but sanitized sometimes can be a struggle. And I've had some farmers get really defensive with me about the stacking their crates on the ground to dry or whatever. I've had some farmers be one farmer get emotional and start to cry, and I was what? But it's not. It's sort of just improving the logic and the thought process. If this is clean now, then it can't touch the floor. And actually, I think Chris earlier was saying listeria is something that maybe farmers don't know. I think it was Chris, that listeria maybe isn't one of the pathogens that they're most familiar with. And it's this floor is wet. This floor has open drains. You can't just stack your harvest crates after you've washed and sanitized them on top of this floor drain. It's not a good idea, man. It's not clean anymore. So educating them on sort of that risk has been important.
In New York, we're seeing some confusion on what constitutes a food contact surface. A lot of the secondary, or maybe not the actual conveyor belts, but where it might touch the wall or a gutter or a secondary surface coming out of a growing hydroponic canal. So we see that. The other thing we see a lot of is confusion with water. When to change the water, when to add sanitizer, when to test the sanitizer, how to measure turbidity, how to use sanitizers to clean and sanitize equipment, especially when it comes to dwell times. Is this an adequate sanitizer? We see a lot of people using cleaners as sanitizers. Also, is it a rinse, no rinse sanitizer? Just proper cleaning and sanitizing use for cleaners and sanitizers.
Thank you. Now we'd like to ask, in your state or in your region, where do you see growers struggling, and what is the underlying issue behind the misunderstanding or misaligned practice? And what do you think is the leading cause for what was observed?
Yeah, so a big area that I see growers struggling in is taking the long list of requirements that they are needing to get done for their inspection for produce safety on their farm and converting that into a culture on the farm with the workers, with the individuals who come visit their farm, their customers, and with their policies themselves. A lot of times, their farmers are just so busy in just the day-to-day activities, and they want to be able to have food safety, and they prioritize, and a lot of times they're doing the right things, but instead of saying, all right, this is something that I need to incorporate, encourage, and make a team effort, have a sense of culture in my farm with food safety, they say, this is A through X that I need to get done. And that's where they tend to start tripping up. That's where they tend to start saying, all right, I have the bulk of this. What's the next big thing to get done? So a majority can be addressed. And oftentimes you see things start to slip in that regard.
Record keeping, surprise. Record keeping's hard. I think farmers are overwhelmed by the thought, especially older farmers I've noticed feel like they have to do all the records. That's their responsibility. A lot of times, I can't make anyone do anything, but a lot of times I will ask someone, especially if they moan to me about, they're like, well, I don't have time to do this. Like, I can't be doing a cleaning and sanitizing record every single day. I'll be like, there's no one else here. You don't have anyone else here that can fill out this form for you, that can do this record. Like, to try and delegate, I think is intrinsically hard, especially for older farmers, but to trust your employees imagine the amount of time it takes to train an employee, even if they only work for you for one season, but the amount of time it takes to train an employee to fill out a harvest record or a cleaning and sanitizing record versus having you do it every single day. Like, I think most employees actually sort of take responsibility like that as a source of pride. I mean, this is my job. I got to fill out this form, and we have to clean it in this way, and then I have to sign this piece of paper. I mean, I think empowering employees by having them participate in that and try to train them up, as opposed to just assuming that I'm the farmer, I have to do all this, I have to keep all this in my brain. Not all records necessarily are created equal either. I mean, I think people think that it's going to have to be like a really nice binder with all this stuff, but like, no, it can be like with 3-ring binder with sheets of paper. Like, no, it can be on a Google Doc. It can be something else. I had a farmer show me, I mean, this record's not perfect, but I had a farmer show me they had, for their cleaning and sanitizing of their wash and pack room, they had on their wall a Julian date calendar that was laminated, and they had like a laminated list of everything they had to do and how to do it. So like, what to wash, the vegetable washer, the green spinner, blah, 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 how to wash it, so like it needs this concentration, you need to wash it with this tool, blah, blah, blah. And then a Julian date calendar, and when they were done, they had to cross the date off the Julian date calendar. That record's not perfect, but that's like the gateway drug of records, right? Like, I'd rather you do that than, like, maybe later we can get you to mainline Google Docs. Like, that's a good start, because you're getting employees to get in the thought process of doing it. Like, I had to say I was impressed with the ingenuity, and so I was like, all right, that's great. That can be improved. We can do better. But that's not a bad start for someone that's like really record adverse, right? If you like, all you got to do is cross the date off. Like, okay, that's not so bad. Like, that can be a way to ease into record keeping.
Yeah, in New York, we see a lot of what these two guys mentioned, but I'm going to piggyback off of what Ben said. We do see a lot of time constraints with cleaning and sanitizing and record keeping. The farmers do kind of the top-level stuff really well in our area. They want to do a good job. They don't want to make anybody sick. But the two things I hear the most is time, and over the last 2 years, it's been personnel, getting personnel, keeping personnel, especially with the records. A lot of them, they say the H-2A workers don't understand how to fill out the record, so it's on them. And I think the farmers are so busy that they're not there. and they're not overseeing every aspect, which they can't, and they're not there to ensure compliance every step of the way with hand washing in the orchards after every break, or every restroom stop, and that every bin or harvest container is getting cleaned and sanitized, or that record's getting filled out properly every day.
Thank you. The next one, we'd like to address a two-part question. Where have you seen educational materials hinder compliance? And do you think this issue can be solved by strictly educational support, or is it an issue that will be corrected by the inspection process combined with education?
Yeah. So the major area that I see education being effective for farmers is when they're presented with information that is relatable to their current operation. And that might seem something basic, but there's such a wide variety of farms. Even in Rhode Island, the smallest state, we have farms of all sizes, all different commodities, and have all different ways to accomplish food safety that are unique to that farm. And so that's why I'm a big advocate of especially education happening on the individual farm itself, because then farmers are able to take the information that you're presenting to them in a relatable and digestible way and say, this is exactly what I need to do. And this is bringing what you're saying to my level. And that takes some of the guessing work out, that takes some of the stress that, I need to go buy this new piece of equipment, multi-$1,000 equipment, to be able to comply with the requirements. And so being able to be on farm, have the conversation with them and say, this is exactly something that can be addressed on your level. It is a sense of relief for them, and something where education has the most benefit. And to answer that second part of the question, I think there's definitely a educate before regulate approach that needs to happen. There needs to be able to talk to them and not have a whole lot of jargon, a whole lot of acronyms, something that they understand and that they can comply with and bring down to their level. There are cases where education is maybe not enough, and you will have to have a combination of education and inspectional observations and force the hand a little bit. But the idea behind it is to make them understand the importance of food safety on the farm and why culture of food safety needs to happen.
So I actually agree quite a bit. Where I see that education is helping is the food safety training on farms that have good food safety training. Like a good food safety training is a firewall between unsafe practices and like the daily realities of farming. There's always pressure to get stuff done. I would also say generally, let's get real, guys. Farm workers expect, because they're paid so little, harvesters, things like that, I think they generally expect their jobs to not be that great. If they walk into a full porta-john with no paper towels and a clogged hand sink, they're like, yep, that's what this job is. That's what I expect. But if you have good food safety training, you're empowering employees to understand that that's an unsafe practice and that they can push back on their on the owner or the manager or whatever to do something about it, rather than being like, yep, this porta-john's disgusting. That's what porta-johns are, and that's what this job is, because I'm only getting paid like X amount of dollars an hour or X amount of dollars per basket. Like, I expect this to be bad. Good food safety training actually empowers employees to call out unsafe practices. And as a guy that managed farms in the past, I will admit that I certainly, in the heat of the moment when you got to get something done, sometimes you want to cut corners. Employees who have had good food safety training, specific food safety training that's personalized to your farm, can push back on you and can hold the line against crossing over to an unsafe practice. That being said, where education sometimes hinder is food safety training, food safety templates, flip books, stuff like that. A lot of farmers are like, hey, just give me the book so that I can just sit here and flip the book, right? I'll get the Penn State flip book and we'll just like do the thing. None of my employees look like these employees. We don't harvest any of the things that are in this book, and I would just do the thing real quick, and then it'll take 5 minutes, and we'll just get back to work today. Most trainings, the best trainings on the best farms I've been to, are specific to the farm that they're at. That they're not one size fits all. And I'm constantly encouraging farmers. I'm like, you can use the Penn State flip book. You should. It's a good flip book, but it needs to be paired with farm-specific information about what you guys are doing, like talking about where are your porta-johns, when did they get cleaned, what do our records look like, do you inspect packaging material before using it, because maybe your packaging material is kept in a barn that's like not totally secure from the outside, a very, very common thing. Like, you should include in your training, like, I can't make you build a new barn to keep your wax boxes in, right? I mean, you oughta, but I'm not going to punish you for your infrastructure. If all you've got is this tobacco barn, that's all you've got. So, but in your food safety training, you should have that we inspect packaging before we take it out, because it's not 100% secure from the outside. I mean, that's the kind of stuff that's the difference between, I have to do the training because we have to just get this over with, as opposed to I'm empowering employees to understand what a food safe practice is, where risks are, and how they can, and what their responsibilities are, and what my responsibility is as a manager and owner to them to keep a food safe environment.
Yeah, I think in New York, the most successful educational program that we've seen related to the produce safety rule is probably, unfortunately, subpart E, the pre-harvest water. I don't think a lot of growers were doing the testing prior to. I know most of them were doing one test here or there, but most of them just switched right over and started doing it. And now, unfortunately, subpart E, pre-harvest water, is going to go in a different direction. I think that's going to be very confusing to the farmer. And I think the most hindrance I've seen with food safety training is they do a lot of it at one time. There's just too much of it. I think it's just too much information for the farmer to digest at the PSA grower training. I think on the farm level, they pop that video in. They do everything in one day. It's all the onboarding, all the practices, all the HR documents. And I think a lot of it just gets missed. It's just too much information for one period of time for one person. So a lot of it just goes over their head.
Thank you. Lastly, we'd like to ask, what are some examples where you've seen in your state or your region improvement based on inspectional visits and or a combination of inspection and education?
Yeah. So the one example that comes to mind for me is with a farmer that has a lack of technological expertise and not knowing how to use a smartphone, use a computer, still very much in flip phone day and age. And where we saw an issue was that this farmer thought that a majority of his time with produce safety now needed to be spent creating records, going on the computer, documenting everything digitally. And when we went to go have an educational visit with them, we said, hey, it doesn't necessarily need to be a printout from your computer and a template that you created. While there's helpful tools and templates that we have available for you through our cooperative extension and through other states, it's not necessarily something that you need to use in order to become compliant. You can take what the materials you have, you could take a piece of paper and you can have that information posted on the wall all the same and use that and incorporate that into your daily routine. And you saw a little bit of a light switch hit where it goes, oh, maybe this isn't all this extra work and education and understanding that I need to have beyond the requirements. This is something where I can take it and fit it into my own schedule without it seem like additional burden. And that ended up being very effective. And when we went for the inspection, we saw that he had taken our suggestions and talked to some of other farmers in the community and was able to do very well and be able to have all his records, all his requirements met.
Yeah, I would say this is my first season as an inspector, working with the Massachusetts team. So I don't have a lot to compare it to. I will say that I was impressed. I mean, I always had a very good relationship with MDAR when I was a farmer, and so and I was inspected and audited, and I always felt like I could trust my inspector and my auditor. Mike Batella was my first inspector, and I lied to him like all the time, but I still trust him. And but I will say I was expecting more resistance from farms when I went out. Not a ton, but farms that you can tell and farmers that you can tell are regulation adverse, more anti-government. It's pretty surprising how I think we have a good reputation in that space, and we can work quite well with them. I mean, it's all like small steps, but I've been impressed that farmers seem to trust us, generally speaking, on how things are progressing. And trying to work step by step together. It's been a good working relationship with farmers. I've been impressed that people are willing to, are open to our visits and things at the time.
Yeah, I think, again, to piggyback off of Ben, I think New York's biggest success is just the relationship that we have with the farmers, especially with the veteran crew that we have or had. Wendy, Steve, Matt, Chris, a lot of them guys came over from the GAP program and the farm products, so the farmers were familiar with them. So I think that really helped to build that trust. The other thing is we partnered with Cornell. Cornell is very well respected in the area with our farmers, so we teamed up, did the on-farm readiness reviews, and I think that really helped build the trust with the farmers. And I think the biggest success I have at the end of the day is when you go through the produce safety rule with the farmer, the inspection, and they say, well, that was a lot of common sense. That really makes you feel like, okay, you're not overburdening them, and in the same respects that they know that this makes sense, that this is common sense to them. The other thing that's great is when you're going through the inspections with the farmers and they say, well, I have to do that because that's what my buyer requires, or I have to have that bin cleaned because it goes to my pack house, or it goes to the apple packing house. And a lot of the produce safety requirements line up with what a lot of the buyers line up with, so it kind of gives them buy-in.
Thank you, gentlemen. Do we have time for questions, comments?
Thank you. So, as far as sanitization goes, because it's a critical part of what happens, and there's basically three processes, right? Wash, rinse, sanitize. And I've never seen in any of my farms anything that does those three things separately. As far as the sanitizer goes, simplifying the process makes more sense in my brain and making it a routine. So I'm kind of the ilk that you have a restaurant type system with a 3-bay sink, wash, rinse, sanitize, and then a shelf that they go on to dry. Okay, so that's all sanitized. Can we use on the farm a sanitizing system? They have them in restaurants all the time where you get a 5-gallon bucket of quartz, quaternary sanitizer, right? And you set it on a setting that'll cover the sanitization of everything. So there's no mixing, there's no throwing a tablet in, there's none of that stuff. You hit a button, you fill a bucket, you go and you wipe down the tables after they've been washed and rinsed, or you use the 3-bay sink for washing your tools, rinsing your tools, sanitizing them in the sink. Is that acceptable? And I hear laughing, so it's probably because how do you do that on a farm, right?
Yeah,
Yeah. I could do it, I know that.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say it's acceptable, but it's not always practical. A lot of these farmers have equipment that they use for just a small period of time, and it gets moved out of the way. A lot of farms only maybe wash and pack once a week. There's a lot of different equipment. And obviously that takes money. And not that farmers don't have money, but it's not always an easy thing to have everything cleaned in place.
And
I came from the dairy industry, and we had everything that was clean in place. And don't get me wrong, it was great. You know, you push a button and you walk away, and it was all automatic. But I mean, you're talking hundreds of thousands of dollars, and it's probably not practical.
You know, I get the feeling as I'm going through trainings that we really do expect our farmers to be certified and trained and continually updated on this stuff. And it's very difficult. You've all said that one way or another because it changes and you have to recertify people, etc. Keeping it simple, to me, makes more sense. So as long as a farm manager is certified and his farm workers have a knowledge of what should be done, the farm manager is the guy who needs to be keeping them doing the right things, filling in the charts. I mean, I can't imagine a farm worker filling in charts. It just doesn't make sense to me, you know. There's just a lot of things that I don't think we think of sometimes because we think they may be too difficult, or there is a problem with money. And there is always, whether it's a restaurant, whether it's on a farm, but get the money, figure it out, and then create a habit. The habit is what keeps everything correct most of the time. That's all.
Yeah, I would say, certainly, your question's pretty broad-ranging. There's a lot of different sanitizing, cleaning and sanitizing solutions. And by solutions, I mean like methods and different ways to do things. I think I often try to, don't worry, farmers are going to find the simplest way to do it. They don't want it to be complicated at all either. So, there's not, there's a lot of different methods. I like to try and always mention, I think farmers sometimes think that there's like a very prescriptive, like the PSR somehow tells them that it has to be a certain, you know what I mean? It's like, oh, you have to set up your wash station and stuff this way. It's not really like that. I'm constantly being like, well, I saw this at this place. I've seen it done this way here. I used to do it this way here. I try to give a lot of different options because there's normally a lot of ways to get to the end goal. It's interesting you say, though, I did go to a farm this year that had, they had a system for quats, and it was like automatically distribute into a water supply or whatever so that they could wash in there. And the crew were using not quats. They were putting it in there so it wasn't the correct concentration. So instead of the correct solution, it was set for the solution for quats or whatever, but it was that's not what they were putting into the system. They were putting something in different, so it's not mixing it at the right concentration. And the farmer was annoyed that I was like, well, you can't do that. I was like, what's the concentration for this different sanitizer you're using? He's like, well, I figure it's the same. It's like, you figure. Sometimes, even something that's supposed to be a time saver, but it's like I guess how you're saying, like a food safe culture. It's like, okay, man, but you got to know, you got to put in the right thing into the machine, or the machine doesn't work the same way.
Most of those systems by big companies or even small ones, towers, because they usually have three, 4, or 5 different settings for different solutions. Okay. And you can lock them in, and occasionally they go off. So a farm manager needs to know how to set it and take a test to make sure. But I don't know. Simplification is and then habit, I think, is the way to do it. And however you do it, there's a million ways to do it, And every time you come up with an idea, it's not going to work. Problem solving is come up with a solution, it doesn't, and you may have 10 failures before you have something that is acceptable to everybody. So,
Other questions?
Can you give some examples of interesting or innovative solutions you have seen to problems?
Just problems.
No, just give me some food safety, interesting or innovative solutions. We're talking about a lot of the misunderstandings or noncompliance, but I want to flip it and see what have you seen that growers have done to address or to actually address this.
Not especially.
So I think Chris kind of started to hit on it, right, where he said, we just had a conversation, like you don't have to have technology, right? You can do paper. That's not necessarily innovative. But I think where have you seen something where maybe there was a misunderstanding, but having that conversation and working toward a solution, it was like, oh, there were these moments of clarity, or it was a simple fix. I mean, one of the things we talked about with the educator group yesterday was making it small and attainable, digestible. It's not the whole thing. You don't have to bite off, you don't have to do the whole thing at once, but you can take on these little pieces. And so it would be great to hear sort of these small, and it came up in Christina's talk too. One of the quotes you had, where are you, Christina? What said, it needs to be these small pieces. And so I just think, this is Andre's question, actually. He just spoke it in my ear, and I thought this is good, because I want to hear a little bit more about that. Because as we go into the breakout groups, a lot of it's going to be talking about these small solutions to these problems, right? That's the idea of the breakouts, is where can we start piece by piece to address the problems that you're seeing on farms. And just in the panel, I could hear, for example, putting stuff on top of a drain, right? That's an issue, but that's an easy solution. And all of a sudden, you don't have that challenge anymore. So this is like a cleaning and sanitizing issue, but it's this small thing of they're stacking their bins on drains just because it's just not known that maybe it might just be like a workflow thing. Let's think about the flow within your pack house or whatever that moves stuff off the drain and puts it on a pallet in the corner where you're not going to have that. And all of a sudden, you see that issue disappear on that operation. So I'm just wondering if you can think about instances where over the years, as you've been on farms, where have you seen those simple fixes that have resolved an issue or started to move a person out of those challenges? Yeah.
I'll start you off.
All right, here's Andre. Sorry.
So Route 5 Farm up in Vermont had an interesting solution with stainless steel bread trays and their bins, which you said bins on floor. They had they color code theirs, and so there are one color goes to the field and one color is for storage, but they all have to be washed and sanitized. And so they have, of course, like every farm, a broken one, and they bolted it to a stainless steel bin, and that's the bottom. And now the bins are stackable by color on a stainless steel rollable cart, so when they get to the end of their wash and sanitizing line, they just throw it on that. They don't fall over because the bottom one is bolted to it, and it actually keeps everything off the floor. So that's like an interesting solution to one of the problems that you guys brought up in your observations. So any of those kinds of solutions, I think we're all, as people who pass on food safety things, are interested in hearing these so that we can pass them on when we encounter them in other situations.
Yeah, I had one similar to what he was saying there, Andre was saying. They have a big winery, and then they have a small U-pick cherry operation where they were cleaning their buckets and then just putting them on the driveway. And, obviously that's not good. So, really, all they did was took a 4x8 sheet of plywood, made a frame, painted it white, stuck some wood drilled holes in it, and stuck some wood dowels on it, and now they just hang all their buckets. Super easy. The other thing I've seen, some of these farms have, 4,000 harvest lugs. A couple of them have bought dishwasher where you just kind of slide them through and then everything gets spray washed, sanitized, all in one step. So it saves them a lot of time.
Yeah, I did have a farm. I did have a farmer who was making all of his wax boxes in the morning and then stacking them on top of a drain. And I was like, "Hey, man, don't stack clean wax boxes on top of a drain." And he was like, "Well, what do you want me to do? Where should I put them?" And I was like, "Well, I mean, you could put them on a rack. You can put them on a pallet." And he was like, "Nah, it's too big. I'm afraid people will trip. It's like tight in that corner." Apparently, that's like where the wax boxes have to go. So I was like, "Well, could you get like 4 cinder blocks and 2 pieces of wood, and to like 2 2x4s to go across, and you could just like stack them on top of that?" And he was like, "Oh yeah, I'll do that right now." He like called someone over and was like, "Grab the cinder blocks on the back," and then did. And I was like, "Okay, great. That's a perfectly fine solution." There's probably something more elegant, but like today, like we get the wax boxes off of the drain. That sounds great. Yeah, that sounds cool to me.
So one common one that I find is the ability of hand washing out in the field for farm workers. I typically see a lot of farms get very intimidated by the fact that they have to go and now purchase a whole new wash station along with their a porta-john so that their workers have an accessible route for cleaning and sanitation. And so the basic example that we give is, just have a bucket, a jug of water in the back of the truck and have a roll of paper towels and it's simple soap. And that way your workers can wash their hands and be able to have an affordable option for you instead of actually having to purchase a monthly hand washing station that needs to be refilled and serviced regularly. A little bit more accessible.
Is there one more question? Oh, Lisa has a question. Ben, I just wanted to ask about the record keeping that you mentioned earlier with the Julian date thing. Is your issue with that the lack of preservability, like the fact that it was a wipe-off thing? Like if someone took a picture of that at the end of the day and they had their protocol written out that said Julian date crossed off means all tasks were completed for this date and kind of filed it under, a record for that day, would that satisfy your desires for that record?
So that particular farmer I know is especially adverse to the rules and the regs. That record seemed notoriously easy to fake, right? Like like oh God, Ben's coming! Quick, check off every single day from the last time he was here. But I took them at their word that they were doing it. I did ask. I was like, "How do you keep that record?" Because it can be like wiped off, and the farmer very nonchalantly pulled out their phone and was just like, "There." And I was like, "Okay, cool." They actually had a sign above it that said, "This record has to be filled out every single day because MDAR says so." And I was like, "Okay, sounds great." I think some of the records, they want to have yeah. I think it was its impermanence that worried me. But I mean, I've suggested it to other farmers. It's not the worst idea that I've ever, you know what I mean? I would rather it be in a more permanent form of some kind or something that's a little bit more verifiable. But I was really encouraged that they had, because it'd be one thing if you're like, "Oh, this is our record, it's just a Julian date calendar," and you just cross it off. But they also had the laminated instructions. Here's how you clean, and there were boxes for checking off. You've finished, you've cleaned this piece of equipment, this way. I wanted to give them credit for that. But yeah, I was a little worried that it was sort of easy to forge.
I can just imagine recommending that method that you just the Julian date thing to somebody and with the picture, and if they can say, if they do have a record of a photograph of every day from the last 3 months that it has been checked off.
And I know a lot of records, and I know a lot of template records will say they'll want a manager's signature at the bottom, at the end of every month. No farmer's ever done that. They always do it just before you show up. I mean, no one's ever been like, "Oh wait, we can't pick corn. I got to go back and sign this week's sanitation log." That's not true. Yeah, I mean, I actually thought it was kind of a clever solution, and especially for people that were really record averse. It's this isn't so bad. That's an easy fix, They would fall over dead if they knew I suggested that to a group of regulators and educators. If they knew, they would be like, "You did what?"
Great. Thank you all very much. One more. Deb?
Yeah, you need to have a leap year one and a not leap year one. Yeah, that's also fun to explain.
Great. Thank you all. We're taking a break for 15 minutes. Enjoy.